Welcome to another biology video in the chapter Senses and Coordination. Today we're going to do two paragraphs. Paragraph 6, the nervous system, and paragraph 8, voluntary and involuntary actions. We're combining these together because they just go hand in hand with each other, and we might as well just immediately explain them. Today you'll learn about three neurons. There are three different types of neurons. The neuron pathway, so where the path an electrical signal takes in the nervous system, and I've not written it down, but involuntary and voluntary actions, examples of them, and what they actually mean, and the reflex arc. So how is a reflex different from voluntary and involuntary, and from a normal action? So very quickly, what we're going to learn in this video. So we start with a neuron. A neuron is your nervous system consists of special cells. Three different types of cells, but these special cells we call nerve cells or neurons. You have to familiarize yourself with these words. Before we're going to look at the three different types of neurons, we're going to look at what these neurons have in common. What they have in common is their function. All they do in the nervous system is passing along electrical signals. So all day long, all they do is passing along electrical signals, the impulses. Besides that, they have a basic build. They might express it a little differently, but they have a basic build which is very similar in all three. They have a part in which the impulse, so the electrical signal, it arrives at the neuron and it goes to the cell body. And this part is called the dendrite. So it arrives at the neuron, and as you can see by the arrow, it goes to the cell body, so the part where you can find the nucleus. And this part is the dendrite. Then the cell body, it's where you find the nucleus and most of the organelles, so cytoplasma, mitochondria, etc. Everything to keep the cell alive and going. This is the cell body. And then you have a part of the neuron where it goes away from the cell body. So it has tail-like structures where it goes away. And as it says, away and axon, A for away and A for axon, maybe you can remember it like that. So once again, we start at the dendrites, we go to the cell body, and then we follow the axon away. So we arrive in the neuron at the dendrites, over the cell body, and we go away from the neuron in the axon. The three types of neurons also have differences. So they have the common buildup, but they have differences in this buildup. They also have differences in the location, but we'll get back to that in a very later slide. So this drawing we've seen before, except to confuse you guys, I'm going to swap the direction around. So it arrives at the right side now, so the right side are the dendrites. This side is going to the cell body, then we have the cell body, and then it goes away from the cell body through the axon. This type of neuron, it's actually a neuron, is called the interneuron. Yeah, let's keep it at that. It's the interneuron. Then we get to the second neuron, but first I need to explain about a sensory cell. So remember, we have sensory organs: ears, skin, tongue, eyes, and what am I forgetting? Nose. In all of these organs we have special cells which are capable of interacting with the stimuli. So in the retina we have sensory cells which are capable of catching light. The sensory cell creates that impulse, the electrical signal. That electrical signal is sent to a neuron. So we first start with the dendrite, because it hasn't been past the cell body yet. Then we get a cell body, and an axon. As you can see, it looks different from the interneuron. It has a long dendrite and it has a long axon, and the cell body is on top of it. This is an appearance you have to memorize. Shouldn't have to be able to describe it, but if you see a picture, you should see that's a sensory neuron. Oh, I forgot to mention sensory neuron. This is called a sensory neuron. So we have an interneuron, which looks a bit like a star in my opinion, and the sensory neuron, which is connected to the sensory cell. Now we have another neuron. This one starts with short dendrites, a cell body. So the dendrites are connected immediately to the cell body, just like the interneuron. But then it has a really long axon. So it has short dendrites where the impulse arrives, a cell body, and a very long axon. That axon is connected to what we call an activator, a muscle, often. So for example, do you want to move your finger? You need to use your muscles. Your brain sends an impulse to your motor neuron. And that electrical signal your brain sends over the motor neuron causes your muscle to contract or relax. This way causing movement. So once again we have interneuron, which looks a bit like a star, a sensory neuron which is connected to sensory cells and has two long parts, and we have a motor neuron which is connected to a activator. We call these activators, which are often muscles or glands or something which has an active function. So in a pathway, we would start with a sensory cell. This sensory cell is in our retina. The retina catches light, so it sends an electrical signal over our sensory neuron. So remember, first dendrite, then cell body, and axon. So that sensory neuron is a very long one. It goes from our retina, it goes all the way to our spinal cord. So that's one sensory neuron. So first sensory neuron to spinal cord. And in our spinal cord is nothing more than a web of interneurons. The sensory neuron gives the impulse to an interneuron, that one gives it to another interneuron, that one to another, to another, to another, till it's finally, I can't draw that many, but you can imagine that these would be thousands and millions of interneurons before it's in our brain. But finally it gets into our brain and to our visual area of our brain. And then we say, hey, I can see a snake now. Or cool, a snake. Then your body is like, hey, I want to run away from that snake. So it sends a signal over a motor neuron, which is connected to a muscle, or an activator. And that muscle goes run, 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 run. Yeah, well, you can imagine that it activates a lot of motor neurons and many muscle cells now start to move, causing the running motion. A different example, let's start at the start again. So, there is a snake, a stimulus. We see it, impulse is created, send along our sensory neuron. Sensory neuron sends it to our spinal cord. Then it goes from interneuron, interneuron, interneuron all the way up to our brain until the brain says, hey, that's a snake. Your brain, whatever message, or it says danger, or it says, hey, that's such a cute snake, let's go try and pet it. So you send another impulse, electrical signal to your motor neuron, which is connected to the muscles in your hand this time, and you go try and pet the snake. This is what we call a sensory pathway, or a neural pathway. That it starts as a sensory neuron and, well, it can end at the brain, so it can end at the interneuron, but if you act upon it, it ends at the motor neuron. This is the standard one. Now, I'm gonna explain involuntary and voluntary actions here. So let's stick with the snake. So you see the snake and you want to pet it. Not a smart idea in my opinion, but that's a reaction. This is a voluntary action. You want to pet it, or you want to step on it, or you want to run away. This is a voluntary action. An involuntary action was seeing the snake and starting to sweat. So you can imagine, instead of a muscle, it would be the motor neuron would be connected to a sweat gland. Even if you don't want to, sweating is an action you cannot control. For example, blinking your eyes. You can blink your eyes right now. You can tell yourself blink your eyes. So that's a voluntary action. But for example, if you keep your eyes open for a minute, at one point your body gets the trigger, your eyes are dry, please blink. And even though you don't want to, at one point your body will make you blink. So in this case, blinking can be both voluntary and involuntary. So when you tell yourself, okay, blink now, it's voluntary. And blinking when you are not thinking about it or not, trying not to, it's an involuntary action. Try and make examples for yourself in case it would be on the test, of course. So try and make a good example of what is an involuntary and a voluntary action. Now we go to the next one, a reflex arc. So I'm sure you all know the scene where somebody goes to the doctor and the doctor taps with this little hammer thing on the knee of the patient. What the doctor is trying to do, he's trying to get a reflex. And what happens is, so it's just below the kneecap, and so the sensory neuron is triggered. So there is a sensory cell in the skin that sends the signal to the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron arrives at the spinal cord, just like before. However, now something different happens. So usually the interneurons would send the signal up to the brain. So interneuron, until it goes into the brain, and the brain is like, ooh, I feel that tap. But, however, reflexes are different. Reflexes don't go up to the brain first. So from interneuron, it goes immediately back to a motor neuron which is near to it. And that motor neuron is connected to the one of your muscles in your leg, and it causes you to move your leg, whether you want it or not. So the only difference here is that it doesn't need to send, so it's an involuntary action, because even if you don't want to, you move it. But the difference is with a normal pathway is your brain hasn't gotten the message yet, and you're already moving your leg. It hasn't gone up to the brain yet. It just took a shortcut. And yes, he will also feel the tap on his knee, because the signal is not only sent to the motor neuron, but also a signal sent to the brain. But the shortcut goes first. And the knee tapping is actually a bad example, because it's a biased reflex. But however, if you grab a hot pan, so a pan has been on a fire and you didn't realize that it's been on the fire for 10 minutes, and you grab it, often you let go before you actually feel the pain. So what happens is, it goes from the sensory cells in your skin, they get triggered, so the sensory neuron goes to your spinal cord, and the interneuron sends it immediately back to your hand to let go, and then you drop a pan of hot water. And then a second later, you're like, ooh, that was hot. That's the reflex. So before your brain actually has the message, you already let go because it took the shortcut. The impulse to your brain is still on the way, but you already let go. Now, why would that be? Imagine you hold that hot pan just 1 or 2 seconds longer. You can imagine why a reflex is important. So, a reflex is not only voluntary and an involuntary action, but it's also a shortcut. So, it's a much more extreme involuntary action. It does not need to go to the brain, and it just takes that shortcut. Don't forget, the reflex also goes to your brain, but it prioritizes going to the shortcut first. And this is what we call a reflex arc. In the test, you need to be able to describe both a normal pathway, so first going to brain and then taking a motor neuron, and also the reflex, so from sensory cell in the spinal cord to the interneuron and into the neuron immediately back to a motor neuron. That's the only difference. They pause the brain for a second. Well, this was in short, it's 16 minutes, so this was voluntary, involuntary, and the neurons. You should be able to name the neurons and the order in which they appear and the pathways, so you need to be able to describe if I say, well, something happens here. Tell me how it gets to your brain and tell me how you result in sweating, for example. Well, if you have questions, please do ask. Good luck studying.